All right, welcome to the final week number 6 of our study on the Sermon on the Mount with Southeast Online called Everything is Backwards, where again, we keep bringing up that theme that everything that we think about life and the values we have tend to be backwards from really the kingdom life that Jesus desires for us. And so this is the concluding part. This is Jesus winding the message up. This is an invitation. And I love this section of scripture because he talks about the wide path and the narrow path. He talks about the wide road that doesn't lead to the things we want, but it's really easy to take. But the road to life is super narrow and it's super difficult. And so we're going to dial in to being personally applicable to this message of what does this really do to us and what are the things we need to do to make sure we're on the narrow path, to make sure that we have the values that can withstand the storms of life, that no matter what happens, our faith endures, and that we have a firm foundation in the things that will endure beyond this world. So glad that you're here. Get ready. This is week number 6, our final part as we conclude Everything is Backwards. All right, guys, so we're concluding this week the Sermon on the Mount. It's the conclusion. It's driving everything to kind of this culminating moment with this. And the idea is everything is backwards on this. And Jesus establishes a couple things in this and makes a firm call that if you're going to be a member of this eternal kingdom that never ends, it's not the simple route. And he gives a lot of illustrations on it. And one of the things I quote to my kids all the time as a parent, I love this verse, is the road to destruction's wide. It's well marked. It's well paved. It's really easy to travel down. The road to life is narrow. Few find it. It's off to the side. It's counterintuitive. It's such a beautiful picture of there are so many people on this journey to a destructive ending and don't know it. And wide is that path and easy is that road. So as we think about Jesus being this dividing line in all of history and bringing a conclusion, let's go personal for you on this. Is how has this been personal to you on taking the narrow path to life, Sarah? Like when you think about all the different decisions you make, how does it hit the narrow path?
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out most to me about the narrow and wide gates is, and I have this written in my Bible, you have to follow closely to even find the path. And the path, because it is narrow and it twists and turns, like you're not going to be able to navigate it on your own. And so usually, like think about hiking in the woods. If you're on an unusual path, like you either have some kind of guidance or have somebody leading you down. And I've thought about that my whole life of just like, there's been so many twists and turns in my own life that I've had to follow Jesus really closely to even like be here, which is really crazy. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can easily veer off that path because it looks enticing and it is easier to travel down and there's not as many twists and turns, but just following Jesus really closely down the small path is really just the key to understanding who God is and following him every single day.
It's not going to be found in the common route with that. And I think that that's true. I think a lot of times on an illustration with that is I love visiting national parks. And when we went to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, we did 2 kind of major hikes. One was really easy and one was more significant. Neither were impossible or, super hard. But what's funny is one of the simpler hikes that's like literally lined with a boardwalk we did with my kids, and it's an amazing view. But everybody that goes to Rocky Mountain National Park, I see that picture of that same lake. It's beautiful, but I'm like, that wasn't the hard one. My favorite picture, you'll see me use it as a background on my phone from time to time, isn't that one. It's the one where we hiked like above 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet. It had a high vertical to it. We were huffing and puffing. We had a midway conference with the 4 of us. And I said to my wife and kids who were doing this harder hike for me, it's okay. I've seen enough. We can go down. And finally, Eileen, my daughter, looks and goes, no, we're going to make it. And so we huffed and puffed and there's a mountain lake on top. And that's the picture no one has, because that was the narrow road to it. And I think that that's what it is, that there's a hidden blessing, Brandon, that's beyond and taking this narrow path. So as you think about Jesus setting this path very narrowly for us, personally, how do you interact with that?
I think kind of along the same lines of what Sarah was thinking, is that oftentimes that path that Jesus has us on is not an easy one to understand. Like, it feels like it's bending and it's twisting in ways that you wouldn't expect. And, I guess, there's a reason why people choose the wide path, right? Because it looks better and it looks nicer. And, but it's the path that Jesus has us on is ultimately the path that leads to something, that leads to life, that leads to wholeness, that leads to fullness. And it's the challenge and the struggle of living that kind of backwards life we've been talking about is, it's going to look crazy when you're on that path sometimes. Like, you're walking against the way the road seems to be going for everybody else. But that doesn't mean it's the wrong road. In fact, it may mean it's the perfect one.
For sure. Derek, what about you?
That's a good question. It brings me back to one of the things Kyle said in a sermon several years back. He was like, God doesn't so much care of where you're going, but about who you're becoming. And that's one of those things. Normally I don't remember, things that people say. For some reason, that's always stuck with me, because I think for so long, especially like during college, after college, I was so obsessed with like, am I doing what God is calling me to do? Am I following His will? How do I do that? And for whatever reason, I think over the past several years of my life, I've learned that as long as I am with Jesus, I am going to end up in the right place, And so for whatever reason, I think that He's brought me through different things to where I have to give up the fact that I can't predict what's going to happen. I can't control what's going to happen. I can't, figure all that out. But what I do know is that I can put my trust in Jesus. And, at the end of the day, for us in the 21st century, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, a lot of times it's a lot easier than what the first disciples were called to literally leave their trade, their family, to go and follow and completely throw themselves into this thing. And we're called to do it in the same way, just not as always as radically as that may look, but in our hearts, it has to be the same.
I think for sure on that. And when I think about our life, what's funny is we all really do want the comfortable, simple life. But what I think about it is, what days you never remember? You never remember the day that you walk out into your garage and start your car. It starts right up and the commute is super clean and simple. And then you park it and you just have a pretty comfort-filled, normal day. And then you go home to a normal meal. You don't remember those days. I remember the day that the dog threw up on my couch. I won't forget those days. I remember the day you're stuck on the side of the road with a blown out tire. I remember those curveballs and twists and turns, and you learn way more in life through that. And it really is an invitation, because when those storms come in and when life happens, I love the storm analogy, right? The house that's built upon the rock will endure. And so a lot of what these values are pursuing a relationship that will endure with God through the twists and turns of life that will happen, and that your relationship with God is going to endure through that. And so as we look through it with an endurance lens, and we think about these final verses helping us to pursue a relationship with God over religion, over anything else. How does that inform your personal faith, Sarah? Like, when you think about it in those terms, what's it make you think?
Gosh, I think just growing up in the church, I was so heavy on religion and light on relationship. And I think this is so freeing for the people who would have been deep in religion, but it's also way harder because relationship takes a lot of work. You have to be more vulnerable. You have to work at it. And it's interesting because it's just occurred to me, I don't know why, but when you're building a foundation on rock, you have to take time to set the foundations deep in that rock.
Yeah, it's slower. And it's so, this whole Sermon on the Mount is culminating to this moment, because he's saying those spiritual disciplines that you're going to work really hard at, it's going to matter down the road. And especially like if you're building on sand, it's going to wash away. And just like that really surface level theology or your beliefs aren't going to work. You got to sink your roots down really deep. You reminded me of my brother who literally built a house, and I walk into it completed for the first time. It's a cool house, and he slaps the side of the wall and he goes, "These are built with 2x6s, not 2x4s. It's not going anywhere." He was so proud of that, and he made that investment, which is more expensive, but that's what you're talking about. You're not gonna have a house built with a 2x4,
No.
which is what I'm sure all 4 of our houses are built with, and probably all yours. But he did that, and I think there's so much truth in taking that time, because it is the heavy lifting. Derek, how about you personally?
Yeah, I think exactly what Sarah's saying, where it's something that Sarah said 3-4 weeks ago in our study, was that like those spiritual disciplines to stay on the track of making sure we're following Jesus, a lot of times we can't see the fruit of it. It's like exercising, to where you're doing this exercise that is building these muscles or doing things for your body that you don't necessarily see the benefits of right away. And literally each and every one of us, if like you start a new workout program or a diet or nutrition plan, whatever it may be, if we don't see results in like a short period of time, very easy to quit. Very easy to quit. And so in terms of endurance, like I have to remind myself that we're just in it. Right. That we're just in it. And I know, Steve, like you've had experience running a marathon, and I tried to get into doing like distance running last year, and I got up to like 9 miles was the most. And what helped me, the hardest thing for me in running distance wasn't the toll on my body. It was the toll on my mind.
It is. Yeah.
It was a toll on my mind. And I noticed every time that I would be counting the miles, the harder the run felt. But the more I just accepted that, hey, I'm just in this, and I'm going to try to enjoy it, and I'm just going to be a part of what's going on in this whole 9-mile journey, it's amazing how much of a better experience it was. And so I try to do the same thing. In my relationship with Jesus, is realizing that I'm going to be in different seasons. He's going to take me through different struggles. And at the end of the day, my job is to learn to trust him.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about with this is God's not fooled like by our attempts to puff ourselves up. You know, he's like we're not going to trick him. and it's just over and over again.
Oh,
there's so many things where like, you know what? We fooled him. We fooled him. Like, he doesn't really know the real truth behind the scenes. He knows it all with all that. And to use the house analogy again, I think, and Jesus uses this house analogy here, is we just went through this journey of buying a home. We probably looked at 50, 60 homes because real estate's crazy right now. And what's funny though is when you start going to homes, you get really good at it, because I'm looking at a very narrow price point, narrow location, and very quickly I could tell lipstick on a pig. Like, you knew the DIY ones where you're like, it was like me trying to do it, and I'm like, yeah, it wouldn't be a good plan. And you could just start seeing through some of the things very, very quickly. And it was sort of like, well, they won't notice the real problem if I do this, a fresh coat of paint, on a problem. But those may work in real estate from time to time, but ultimately it won't. And really, that's the hard parts of life, help to declare that and reveal those parts of our lives that aren't adding up, that don't mess up, that we're relying on puffery instead of on the foundation. What about you, Brandon?
So I want to paraphrase Tim Keller a little bit, which took to week 6 for me to quote Tim Keller. So I feel pretty good about that. But I was listening to a sermon of his recently where he talked about the difference between religion and relationship. And his idea was basically that religion is that God is useful, that he's useful for me, and that he does good things for me. But that relationship is that God is beautiful. And he said there's a big difference there, because once God stops becoming useful, if you're practicing religion, then what's the point?
Yeah.
Like, why follow him anymore? But once you start to see that relationship and understand, no, it's not that God is useful, it's that God is beautiful and he's worth following just for who he is, then that makes it easier when you walk through times of difficulty and times of storms, like Jesus talks about here, is that I don't have to sit here and feel like the house is falling down, because I have my gaze fixed on someone who is more magnificent than anything I can imagine. And I think that's ultimately, what Jesus is calling us into here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, is just to remember that, ultimately a storm is coming at the end. But the storms we go through in life, they're going to knock us down. and they're going to threaten to blow the house down around us. But if we've dug down into that rock and we've built our foundation there, then it's going to stand, and it's all going to be okay in the end. And that's, I think, the hardest truth to hold on to sometimes when you feel, when you hear the 2x6s creaking and you feel the shingles getting torn off the roof and it feels like everything's going to fall apart on you, just to focus your gaze on the one who is more powerful than anything, and just know, okay, he's got this, and it's going to be all right.
Yeah, I think that's a good word. So as we conclude this and bring conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount, and this call for the dividing line for our foundation to be where it needs to be, that we're not going to be foolish with it, I want you guys personally to interact with this now. Kind of the final thing, as you bring a summation to the last 6 weeks of this key teaching, I want one takeaway kind of from each of you personally of like, what's your one thing you're going to say, all right, I'm walking out of this, Derek. I'm walking out of here, and this is kind of what I'm thinking of.
If I had to choose one thing that I'm thinking about from all of this, is just like what Brandon just said, like the difference between religion and relationship, that it really is beholding the beauty of God, and just how Jesus is personified all the way through the Sermon on the Mount, and that I have no ability within myself to be that way, but that he would include me. That each and every one of us, whether we believe it or not, are those people that are, unimportant, right? Sitting there on that hillside listening to Jesus. And so I think it's just a reminder for me of putting myself back in that place of like it's my job to follow and obey, and not to be the one that's creating that.
Yeah, that's good.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think a lot of mine is similar to Derek. I keep going back to verse 3 of chapter 5 of the Beatitudes, where he just starts off with, blessed are the poor in spirit. Or as I said a few weeks ago, like, blessed are those who have nothing to offer. And so I just think of myself and think of, oh my gosh, like I have nothing to offer Jesus. But like Derek said, this whole Sermon on the Mount is about him and how he's inviting us into that relationship with him. And it's funny, as Brandon was talking about the storm, there's a quote, I can't really remember how it is, but it's like you're either in a storm, coming out of one, or about to go into one. And so it's such a sweet reminder to have those foundations deep, like really set your foundation only on a like solid bedrock, but on the rock. Those spiritual disciplines are worth it. And so it just all ties together. And like Derek said, like it's all about Jesus and just following him really well.
Brandon, what's your final quick thought?
I just think there in that last picture of the house that Jesus talks about, is it just strikes me that he has, faith isn't the right word, I don't guess, but Jesus has the utmost confidence in us, in a sense, because he looks at us and says, well, anyone who hears these words of mine and obeys them. Like, after everything that Jesus has said, after all of these things that he's laid out before us, he looks at us and says, you guys can do this. Like, you guys can live this way. You guys can be kingdom ambassadors in your world. Like, go do that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he knows, like, well, I'm going to give them my spirit so they can do it. But there's this element where Jesus is saying, like, hey, you guys can be this. And this is not beyond the pale. Like, you can reach out and you can become kingdom people in a fallen world.
I love that. And, I think for me, my final thing that I think of, which helps me out more than any of it, which is a little different than what you guys said, which is I'm not going to fool God. I'm not going to trick him. I might as well be honest. I might as well be sincere and honest and confident in my weaknesses. There is a grace that's there, and there is a confidence to approach God that I don't have to rely and puff myself up and cover for my sin, because it's not possible. So I might as well be sincere. And I think that sincere approach is the bedrock, is the place of authenticity that this is driving us towards, is we might as well know we are not God. We don't measure up, and we should sincerely approach the one that can give us the confidence to approach him on the final day, where he can say, well done. I know you. You are my child. I'm glad you're here.